Welcome back. Last time we focused on getting the data right, and today we're going to work on the actual dialogue. In the character I'm going to make a function called setExpressions with as input parameter the expression data that we set previous video. From there on I want to drag it out to a switch statement so I can do custom functionality per state. But because I mainly want to change textures on our character, I have to go back to the designer tab and expose the expression texture as a variable. And since I'm there anyway, I'm also going to expose the blush texture layer. Now back in the graph, I have actually access to these layers now. So I can just grab them as reference and just say, hey, I want to change the texture on this texture layer. Then I take the reference that we created previous video for all our textures and I can just hook them up. Bear with me though, this will create a gigantic spaghetti. And after we've created that godforsaken monstrosity, I can go back and create a function for the setBlush. It is somewhat going to be the same as the setExpressions. We're using a switch state, but after that we're doing a couple things different. We mainly just set visibility, and after that I'm just going to hard blueprint the textures into the reference slot. Because there's so few textures for this one, I couldn't bear to make a data structure out of it. And the last function is going to be the add romance. Because our character obviously needs some romance, you know. And this is a really easy function because we just take an input value and add that to our current value. Take into account, adding can also be subtracting. Now let's go back to the event graph and set our initial values with our variables. Let's just take it easy for a bit. In here, I just grab the functions that we just created, and as an input, I just take the variables that we made previously. Now let's test out if whatever we just made actually works. So just play the game, and then I'm going back into my background that I created for this level. I just change up some variables, then I go back into play, and as you can see, now it starts off with an angry face instead of a default face. With the character mostly done now, I can go back to my blueprints folder, into the widgets, and create a new widget for my dialogue panel. Once again, I start off making the UI. So I first grab a canvas panel, then a canvas panel inside of the canvas panel, and I set the anchor to anchor itself to the lower part of my screen. Then I space it in such a way that it forms a little box at the bottom of my screen. From here on, you can just do whatever you want to make it look pretty. I'm just going to add a little blur effect. Then I'm going to add a vertical box to the UI. This is going to be used for whenever I spawn in the dialogue entries that they vertically align perfectly. Make sure to have selected the size to content box. This ensures that the vertical box grows with the amount of entries that we spawn in. Then the last thing I'm going to add is a text panel. This is going to be used for the response of our character. We also want to make sure that the text goes to the new line whenever the text falls outside of the text box. To ensure this, we have to enable the box auto wrap text. And the last thing I want to do is expose the vertical box, the text box, and the panel where they are inside of as variables. Now that the dialog panel is created, there's one more widget blueprint that we need to make. That is the actual dialog entry UI, which we're going to spawn in. So let's make a new widget and call this the dialog entry. And this one is going to be very easy. It's just going to be a button with a text in it. In the button we can set all the rendering off except hovering, because we want a little highlight effect when we hover the mouse over the dialog entry. So let's add a text, and for the text we set the fill mode to the entire screen and also enable the auto wrap, and at last we expose these two UI elements as variables. Let's get back in the dialog panel and make some variables. So the first variable that I want to make is a dialog, as in the current dialog we're having. Then also the current character I'm interacting with. Then we want to make sure we have a response variable, and at last a response iteration variable. This one is going to be used for the typing effect. Then I set the response to a string, the response index as an integer, the current dialog, well, as a dialog, and the character must be, well, of type character. Alright, so now let's make some functions, one being start dialog and the other one check romance. For the check romance function, we're just going to take in as input parameters the character and a dialog. In this function we're just going to check whether the romance level of the character is higher or equal than the one of the dialog. Then at last I just return the outcome of this check. Then in the start dialog I'm just taking in as an input the character and the dialog. Then I set my variables with the inputs that I received. From there on I first want to clear the existing dialog entries with the clear children's method. Then I'm going to grab the dialogues and make a for each loop for them. From there on I want to check whether the romance level actually succeeds before spawning in a new dialog entry. So whenever this succeeds I'm going to try and spawn a new dialog entry for our vertical box. Then I want to pass the index of the for loop to this dialog entry, so whenever we click on the button we know which dialog we should load from the dialog asset. So in the dialog entry blueprint I'm going to add a variable named the dialog index of type integer. Coming back in the dialog panel I can now pass the array index to the dialog entry. So I just grab the value from the array index and just pass it through so that the dialog entry knows which new entry it should load whenever being pressed. After that I want to set the text for the dialog entries. The text itself is going to be the text from the dialog, but I want to append some extra elements to that. So first off I want to get the index of the array, so we prefix it with a number. Then I'll offset it with a dot and space, and then the actual text, and pass it on to the text of the actual text element. After creating the dialog entry, I will add it to the vertical box, which should then automatically align them vertically. And at last I want to make sure that the right elements of the UI are being displayed. So in this case I want to make the dialog entries visible, and I want to hide the response box for now. Alright, let's create the start response. This is the character response whenever we select a dialog option. So as an input parameter I take a dialog. From there on I want to set the current dialog to this dialog. Then I want to clear the response so it's all nice and clean. I also want to do the same with the response text box from the UI. Just clear the text. And after that I want to invoke the typing effect. However, I'm using a delay function in there, And in Unreal you cannot do delay in functions, so I go to the event graph and make a custom node to serve as a function that can use and utilize delay. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab the response and take the length out of that. Then I'm also going to do the same of the response from our dialog, and then I will check whether the response that we are building is lower than the actual size of the dialog response. Then I'm going to add the delay. You can just set the delay to whatever you like. Now let's set the text. This is the typing effect, so I get the response and I want to add the next letter from the dialog response. So I grab that one, then I convert that to an array of letters. Then I grab the correct letter with the index that we set up previously. I link that all up. Then after that I increment this integer, so we look at the next letter. Then we just set the text with the current response we are creating. And after that I want to force update this UI element. And after that we're just going to repeat this process to grant that typing effect essentially. Once the response that we are creating is no longer smaller than the one from the dialog, we want to clean it up by setting the variables to their initial state, and then we add a little delay, and as last we just invoke a new dialog with the current character we are talking with and the next dialog that we selected. And now with the typing effect done, we can go back to the start response and add that function at the end of what we already created there. And at last I also here want to set the appropriate visibility for my UI. So I just copy it over from the start dialog and paste it in the start response and swap the right elements around so that the response box is being displayed and the dialog entries are being hidden. Then in the event graph I'm going to delete some nodes that we're not using, and after that I'm going to add on the construct our initial visibility for our UI, and I just want to hide everything essentially because the appropriate things will be displayed whenever we select the character. After that I also want to add some comments so that when we come back we can actually read what we did. With the dialog panel done, there are only a couple things still left to do before we can actually playtest this. So let's open the dialog manager and hook up everything that we just did previously. So let's remove this bit and actually make a new variable for our dialog. And we're just going to grab the dialog from the current character we're interacting with and store that into this variable. After that I want to make a reference to our dialog panel UI so that we can actually start the dialog with the character. From the dialog panel, I just want to invoke the start dialog now, and as an input I'm just going to give the character that we're interacting with and the initial entry dialog of that character. And the last function I want to add to the dialog manager is the select dialog. This is for the dialog options. Whenever you press those buttons, it actually invokes this. So I get the current dialog. From there I grab all the dialogues. Then I get the corresponding dialog with the index that we got passed in. From there I set the current dialog, and then I check whether there's a level present in this dialog, whether we should load to a new level or not. If there is no level present, I'm just going to continue this dialog with this character with the new options that we presented. After that, I also want to apply to the current character we're interacting with the set expression, the set blush, and the add romance from the current dialog that's being loaded. And at last, I just want to check whether there's an audio cue on the current dialogue, and if so, then I just want to play it. And then at begin play in the event graph, I want to make sure that our input mode is set to UI and that our mouse cursor is always on display. Finally, I want to construct the dialog panel and fill in our reference. And when we add it to our viewport, for this one we can set the Z order to 100 because we always want this to be rendered on top of all the other UI elements. Finally, we need to link the dialog entry to the dialog manager. So when we go to the dialog entry, we grab the onClicked event from the button. From there we want to call the select dialog from the dialog manager. And then the last thing we do is grab the dialog index that we set up previously and pass it into the select dialog. So now it's time to create some actual data. Let's make some folders to keep it clean. So I just do my character name. Then I'm just going to make folders for the levels. And in there I'm actually going to add the data assets. One thing to note, the first dialog for your character serves as an entry point and should only contain next dialog options. Then I'm going to create another asset by copying it over, name it appropriately. I just do it by indexing. Then I'm gonna specify in my entry point that the new dialog that I created is the next one. And in here I'm gonna specify my dialog text and the response for my character, plus all the emojis and blush state and so on. Then I go to the background for my level. In there I select my character and under dialog I specify the entry point. Then I'm going to test the game, and as you can see she's all matting, but whenever I press the dialog option you can see the typing effect. Let me just real quick change the starting expression to default again, and from there on I'm just going to make a couple more dialog options. In the dialog, since we made an array for dialogues, you can also specify more dialog options than one, and they will be loaded correspondingly. Alright, and now that I've added some more data assets, you can see that the character is having, well, apparently he's having a bug. Yay! And after some looking around, I saw that whenever I do the typing iteration process, whenever I go back to do the checking for the next letter in the array, I accidentally put the executable pin in the delay while it should have been in the branch where it actually checks for it. So after having fixed this issue, I went back to the game and had a little crying session, but after testing I saw this time around it worked wonders.